The golden gates gleamed under floodlights as midnight security patrols traced their invisible circuits around Britain's most expensive property. Behind those wrought iron barriers, 775 rooms breathed in darkness, their silk wallpapers worth more per square foot than most Londoners earned in a year, their hidden chambers sealed from parliamentary scrutiny, their subterranean tunnels stretching toward Westminster like financial arteries pumping taxpayer blood. The scent of centuries-old mahogany mingled with the sterile air of motion sensors, while somewhere in the bowels of the palace, industrial-grade safes protected documents that detailed expenditures so astronomical they required crown immunity to remain hidden. What the public celebrated as a symbol of national heritage had been built upon the most lucrative real estate transaction in British history, one funded not by royal coffers, but by human cargo. Was Buckingham Palace a palace of the people, or the world's most expensive monument to exploitation? George III's acquisition of Buckingham House in 1761 appeared routine, but the funding sources revealed a darker foundation than any architectural blueprint could expose. The transaction documents, preserved in the royal archives and marked with the king's personal seal, told a deceptively simple story of real estate acquisition. Yet beneath the formal language of purchase agreements and property transfers lay financial arrangements that would transform a modest aristocratic residence into the beating heart of an empire built on human suffering. The morning of May 15th, 1761, found King George III standing in the drawing room of what would become Buckingham Palace, his hands clasped behind his back, as he surveyed the mahogany-paneled walls that still bore the scent of their previous owner's tobacco. Sir Charles Sheffield had decorated these rooms with artifacts from his colonial investments, unaware that his buyer possessed access to wealth streams that dwarfed even the most successful private fortunes. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto Persian carpets, whose intricate patterns had been woven by craftsmen whose nations would soon fall under British dominion. The king's advisors moved through the house like appraisers, their footsteps echoing on polished floors as they calculated not just the property's current value, but its potential as a symbol of imperial power. The official purchase price of $21,000 represented only the visible portion of a financial iceberg, whose true mass remained hidden beneath layers of parliamentary procedure and crown accounting. Contemporary observers noted the speed with which Parliament approved supplementary funding for what officials termed necessary improvements to the royal residence. The Duke of Newcastle, serving as the king's chief financial advisor, had already identified revenue sources that rendered the purchase price almost incidental to the broader imperial project. Letters between Newcastle and Treasury officials, discovered in the British Library's manuscript collection, revealed calculations that treated the palace acquisition as an investment in what they called the architectural projection of British authority. The house that George III purchased had itself been built upon questionable foundations. Sheffield's wealth derived from investments in the South Sea Company, an enterprise whose profits depended entirely upon the transportation and sale of enslaved Africans to British colonies in the Americas. The very floorboards beneath the king's feet had been purchased with money that flowed directly from human cargo holds, creating a symbolic continuity between private exploitation and royal acquisition that few historians have examined with sufficient scrutiny. Sheffield's personal papers, held at the National Archives, contained receipts for furnishings and architectural modifications that corresponded precisely with dividend payments from slave trading ventures. Within months of the purchase, Treasury records began documenting expenditures that exceeded the house's original cost by factors that alarmed even the king's supporters in Parliament. The royal household's demands for modifications revealed ambitions that transcended mere residential comfort. Architects submitted proposals for expansions that would require demolishing adjacent properties, creating gardens that demanded the labor of hundreds of groundskeepers, and installing mechanical systems whose complexity rivaled the period's most advanced industrial facilities. Each proposed improvement carried cost estimates that parliamentary critics described as fantastical beyond reason, yet funding materialized with suspicious efficiency. The timing of these expenditures coincided precisely with the expansion of British colonial activities that generated unprecedented wealth flows through London's financial institutions. Bank of England records from 1762 through 1765 documented colonial tribute payments that arrived in London with remarkable regularity, often within weeks of new parliamentary appropriations for palace improvements. The East India Company alone transferred $400,000 annually to the Crown during this period, while Caribbean sugar profits and North American colonial taxes provided additional revenue streams that rendered domestic criticism of royal spending politically impotent. Parliamentary debates from 1763 revealed growing unease among representatives who questioned the relationship between imperial expansion and domestic royal expenditure. Lord Chatham warned his colleagues that the palace rises as the people's burdens multiply, while radical members demanded transparency in royal accounting that the Crown consistently refused to provide. Government responses to these challenges relied upon arguments about national prestige and diplomatic necessity that masked the fundamental reality of wealth extraction from colonial populations. The scale of financial transformation became apparent through documentary evidence that Parliament had not intended to preserve. Treasury officials' private correspondence, uncovered during 20th century archival research, revealed cost overruns that exceeded official estimates by margins approaching 300% within the first 5 years of royal occupation. By 1767, annual palace maintenance costs consumed revenue equivalent to the total administrative expenses of 3 entire colonial territories. Parliamentary critics calculated that palace expenditures during George III's first decade of residence could have funded the construction of naval vessels sufficient to defend the entire Atlantic trade route. The king's personal involvement in expenditure decisions emerged through surviving architectural plans that bore his handwritten annotations. These documents, housed in the Windsor Castle archives, demonstrated George III's detailed attention to aspects of palace construction that served no practical residential purpose. His notes specified materials whose costs reflected their exotic origins rather than their functional properties, while room dimensions corresponded to ceremonial requirements that anticipated hosting diplomatic events on scales that exceeded any precedent in British royal history. Contemporary observers began documenting strange occurrences within the palace that seemed to coincide with its most expensive construction phases. Servants reported rooms that remained perpetually cold despite expensive heating systems, while others noted drafts that appeared to originate from solid walls where no openings existed. Modern architectural analysis has identified structural anomalies that resulted from hasty construction designed to maximize visible grandeur while minimizing attention to foundational integrity. Whether these phenomena reflected supernatural forces or engineering shortcuts motivated by financial pressure remains a matter of interpretive choice rather than definitive evidence. The transformation of Buckingham House into Buckingham Palace represented more than architectural ambition. It marked the creation of a physical monument to wealth extraction systems that would define British imperial policy for the following century. Every marble column, every crystal chandelier, every hand-carved molding bore invisible connections to colonial populations whose labor and resources funded royal luxury while they faced conditions that approached systematic starvation. The palace emerged not as a symbol of British achievement, but as evidence of exploitation elevated to the status of national heritage through architectural grandeur and ceremonial pageantry that obscured its origins in human suffering. The palace's most opulent renovations coincided precisely with peak profits from Britain's slave trade, creating an architectural monument to human suffering disguised as royal grandeur. Every crystal, chandelier, every marble column, every hand-painted ceiling bore the invisible fingerprints of plantation wealth that flowed through London's banking houses directly into the palace's expanding foundations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand staircase as master craftsmen positioned the final pieces of Carrara marble into place, their Italian chisels carving details into stone that gleamed white as Caribbean sugar. These artisans had arrived in London bearing testimonials from European palaces, yet none had encountered a patron whose resources appeared limitless. The marble itself had been quarried from mountainsides that echoed with the songs of workers who would never see the British palaces their labor adorned. Each step of the staircase required 6 months of cutting, shaping, and polishing by craftsmen whose wages came from Bank of England, accounts that received weekly deposits from Lloyd's of London, the insurance house that underwrote slave ship voyages across the Atlantic. Documents preserved in the Rothschild archive revealed the precise financial mechanisms that connected human bondage to palatial decoration. Lloyd's of London had developed specialized insurance products that guaranteed profits from slave trading expeditions, creating reliable revenue streams that British banks could leverage for domestic investments. The Royal Bank of Scotland, serving as the Crown's primary financial institution, received monthly transfers from Lloyd's that corresponded exactly with palace construction schedules. These transfers peaked during the 1770s and 1780s, when British slave traders transported nearly 100,000 enslaved Africans annually to colonial plantations whose sugar, tobacco, and cotton profits flowed directly through London's financial district into royal construction projects. The throne room emerged during this period as perhaps the most morally compromised space in British architectural history. Its gilded walls rose to accommodate ceremonies that celebrated British civilization while being funded entirely by the systematic dehumanization of African populations. Master decorator Robert Adam received commissions for interior work that required materials sourced from every corner of the expanding British Empire. Gold leaf applied to the room's elaborate moldings had been mined by enslaved workers in South American territories, controlled by British trading companies. The room's famous red silk wall coverings came from plantations in India, where British colonial administrators had imposed production quotas that resulted in widespread famine among local populations. Sir William Chambers, the palace's chief architect during this crucial period, maintained personal correspondence that revealed his awareness of the moral contradictions inherent in his commission. Letters between Chambers and his Italian suppliers, discovered in the Victoria and Albert Museum archives, contained explicit references to the moral difficulty of creating beautiful spaces with profits derived from human misery. Yet Chambers continued accepting royal payments while designing rooms whose magnificence was intended to demonstrate British superiority to visiting foreign dignitaries who were never informed about the wealth sources that made such luxury possible. British slave trade profits during the 1760s through 1780s generated approximately $12 million annually in contemporary currency, equivalent to $1.8 billion in modern purchasing power. Palace renovation costs during the same period totaled $1.5 million, representing $228 million in today's money. Conservative estimates suggest that the labor of 180,000 enslaved people directly funded these improvements through sugar, tobacco, and cotton profits that flowed through London banks to royal architects. The royal household maintained direct investments worth $400,000 in slave trading companies, while a single sugar shipment from Jamaica generated sufficient profit to cover 67% of the grand staircase construction costs. The music room presented perhaps the most disturbing example of beauty created through brutality. Its famous curved walls required acoustic engineering that cost more than most aristocratic families spent on entire estates. Yet, the funding came from plantation owners who used music as a tool of psychological control over enslaved populations. The same melodies that echoed through the palace's carefully designed spaces had originated in work songs that enslaved people sang to coordinate labor and maintain psychological resilience under conditions of extreme oppression. Royal guests who attended musical performances in this room enjoyed entertainment that was both literally and figuratively built upon the suffering of the people whose cultural expressions had been appropriated along with their freedom. Strange acoustic phenomena within the music room began manifesting during its construction phase and continued throughout the following decades. Musicians reported hearing harmonies that seemed to originate from within the walls themselves, while servants described voices that sang in languages they could not identify. Modern architectural analysis has revealed that the room's curved walls create unusual sound reflection patterns that can amplify and distort audio in ways that might explain these experiences. However, some acoustic engineers have noted that the specific frequencies most commonly reported correspond to vocal ranges typical of West African musical traditions, leaving the interpretation of these phenomena open to various explanations. The blue drawing room represented another triumph of imperial aesthetics that concealed moral catastrophe. Its Chinese porcelain collection had been assembled through East India Company trading relationships that depended upon British control of Indian territories, where colonial administrators had imposed taxation systems that created artificial famines. The room's furniture incorporated mahogany harvested from Caribbean islands, where enslaved workers faced mortality rates that approached 30% annually. Each piece of furniture in this room represented not just craftsmanship and beauty, but a specific quantity of human death that British colonial policy treated as an acceptable cost of maintaining global trade dominance. Contemporary observers noted that certain rooms in the palace seemed to retain emotional atmospheres that persisted regardless of their decorative changes. Diplomatic visitors from European courts reported feeling overwhelming sadness in spaces that had been designed specifically to inspire awe and admiration. The French ambassador recorded his impression that the very air within these chambers carries a weight that oppresses the spirit, while Spanish diplomatic correspondents described an inexplicable sense of grief that seemed to emanate from the palace's most luxurious spaces. The white drawing room's expansion during the 1780s required architectural innovations that pushed contemporary construction techniques to their limits while incorporating materials whose costs reflected their origins in human exploitation. The room's famous painted ceiling depicted allegorical scenes of British triumph that celebrated military victories achieved through superior firepower, purchased with slave trade profits. Mercury gilding techniques used throughout the room created toxic working conditions for craftsmen that mirrored the deadly environments that enslaved workers endured on colonial plantations, establishing a pattern of exploitation that extended from imperial peripheries into the heart of royal domestic spaces. Garden construction projects during this period created outdoor spaces whose beauty masked their connection to agricultural systems that depended entirely upon forced labor. The palace's famous rose gardens required soil amendments and fertilizers imported from colonial territories where enslaved workers had died in catastrophic numbers to maintain British agricultural dominance. Seeds and saplings arrived in London aboard ships that had previously transported human cargo, creating botanical displays that served as living monuments to the systematic destruction of African communities and the appropriation of their agricultural knowledge for British imperial purposes. Victoria's vision for transforming Buckingham Palace into Europe's grandest royal residence demanded public funding on a scale that would bankrupt nations, all while Britain's working classes starved. The young queen's architectural ambitions grew more grandiose as her empire expanded, each new wing of the palace corresponding directly to fresh colonial conquests that filled the treasury with gold destined for marble floors. The 18-year-old queen stood in the palace's central courtyard on a frost-covered morning in December 1837, her breath visible in the cold air as she surveyed the building that would consume her subjects' wealth for the next 6 decades. Her advisors had presented architectural plans that transformed the modest residence into a structure rivaling Versailles. Yet none had explained how such magnificence would be financed while textile workers in Manchester faced starvation wages and children died in factory accidents that could have been prevented with safety measures, costing less than a single palace chandelier. The queen's gloved hands traced patterns in the frost covering a windowsill as she contemplated renovations that would require demolishing entire city blocks to accommodate her vision of imperial grandeur. Victoria's first architectural commission revealed the moral bankruptcy that would characterize her entire reign. She demanded the construction of a ballroom larger than Westminster Hall, capable of hosting 1,000 guests in a display of wealth that would demonstrate British imperial dominance to visiting foreign dignitaries. The ballroom's design required engineering innovations that pushed contemporary construction techniques beyond safe limits, while incorporating materials sourced from territories where British colonial administrators had imposed policies that created systematic famine. Gold leaf that would decorate the ballroom's ceiling came from Australian mines where Aboriginal populations faced genocide, while ivory inlays for the room's elaborate decorations came from African elephants slaughtered by hunters, whose expeditions were funded by British colonial authorities seeking to demonstrate their capacity for violence against any form of resistance. Parliamentary records from Victoria's early reign documented a pattern of royal expenditure requests that coincided precisely with reports of domestic suffering that reached crisis proportions. The Queen submitted renovation proposals to Parliament during the same sessions that received testimony about factory conditions that killed children at rates approaching wartime casualty levels. Government ministers who approved palace funding also received reports about urban housing conditions that created disease outbreaks among working families. Yet, royal architectural projects received immediate approval, while public health measures faced years of legislative delay. The contrast between royal luxury and public suffering became so extreme that radical members of Parliament began questioning whether constitutional monarchy was compatible with basic human decency. The Queen's private correspondence with her architects, preserved in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, revealed a personality that combined aesthetic sophistication with moral blindness that approached pathological levels. Victoria wrote detailed instructions about decorative elements that would cost more than most British workers earned in their entire lifetimes, while expressing irritation about newspaper reports describing conditions in industrial cities where her subjects lived in circumstances that resembled medieval plague settlements. Her letters to architect Edward Blore contained specifications for window treatments that cost $3,000 per room, while children in London's East End died from malnutrition that could have been prevented with food purchases costing less than a single curtain panel. The East Wing addition, completed between 1847 and 1850, required $150,000 in public funding equivalent to $19.2 million in contemporary currency. Colonial tribute flowing to the Crown during the same period totaled $2.3 million annually, while Indian diamond revenue directed specifically toward palace improvements reached $890,000. Victoria's reign added 147 rooms to the palace structure, with ballroom construction alone costing $8,400 per room in period currency, equivalent to $1.7 million per room in modern purchasing power. These expenditures occurred while British industrial workers faced average life expectancies of 28 years and childly, mortality rates exceeding 40% in urban manufacturing centers. Construction workers employed on royal projects began reporting experiences that seemed to transcend normal occupational hazards. Masons working on the ballroom's foundation discovered that certain areas of the construction site remained perpetually cold regardless of weather conditions or heating equipment, while plasterers noted that decorative work in specific rooms would crack overnight despite perfect environmental conditions and expert craftsmanship. Foremen attributed these problems to underground water sources that created humidity issues, yet hydrological surveys failed to identify any water features that could explain the persistent structural problems. Modern building analysis has revealed that the palace sits upon geological formations that create unusual electromagnetic fields, which could potentially affect both construction materials and human perception in ways that 19th century workers would have interpreted through supernatural frameworks. The State Dining Room renovation project epitomized Victoria's capacity for moral compartmentalization that allowed her to pursue aesthetic perfection while ignoring the human costs of imperial wealth extraction. She commissioned hand-painted murals depicting scenes of British agricultural abundance for a room where she would host diplomatic dinners celebrating trade relationships with colonial territories where British policies had created artificial famines. The room's mahogany table, carved from trees that had grown for centuries in Caribbean forests, could seat 60 guests for meals prepared by chefs who earned less in a year than the Queen spent on a single place setting. Silver serving pieces melted down and recast for royal entertaining had been mined by enslaved workers whose mortality rates in South American silver mines exceeded 80% within 5 years of beginning their forced labor. The picture gallery's expansion during the 1850s required the displacement of working-class families whose homes were demolished to accommodate the Queen's art collection. Victoria expressed enthusiasm about acquiring paintings that depicted noble themes of British civilization, yet these artworks were purchased with profits from colonial policies that systematically destroyed indigenous cultures through violence that exceeded the brutality of medieval conquest. The gallery's lighting system, considered a technological marvel of its era, required maintenance by specialized technicians whose wages represented less than 1% of the cost of illuminating paintings that celebrated British achievements built upon the systematic exploitation of global populations. Servants working within the palace during this period reported phenomena that seemed to reflect the moral contradictions embedded in the building's very structure. Housekeeping staff described rooms that would become inexplicably dirty overnight, despite being thoroughly cleaned and sealed, while kitchen workers noted that food prepared in certain areas would spoil rapidly under conditions that should have preserved it perfectly. Palace administrators attributed these problems to ventilation issues and pest infestations. Yet, professional cleaning services and pest control experts failed to identify any conventional explanations for the persistent problems. Some historians have suggested that these reports reflected the psychological stress experienced by workers who understood the moral implications of their employment, while others have noted that buildings constructed with materials sourced through extreme violence often develop structural problems that manifest in ways that seem to transcend normal physical causation. The throne room's complete reconstruction during Victoria's reign created a space designed specifically to intimidate foreign visitors while celebrating British imperial dominance through decorative elements that concealed their origins in systematic genocide. The room's famous crimson carpet had been woven using dyes extracted from insects harvested by indigenous workers in Central American territories, where Spanish colonial authorities, operating under British trade agreements, had imposed labor quotas that resulted in population collapses approaching 70% within a single generation. Crystal chandeliers suspended above the throne incorporated lead crystal, whose clarity had been achieved through manufacturing processes that created toxic working conditions in Bohemian factories, where glass workers faced life expectancies reduced by decades compared to agricultural populations. Victoria's architectural legacy transformed Buckingham Palace into a physical manifestation of imperial wealth that celebrated British civilization while being entirely dependent upon the systematic destruction of human communities across 6 continents. Every room in the expanded palace contained materials, furnishings, or decorative elements that connected directly to colonial policies designed to extract maximum wealth through minimum investment in human welfare. The Queen's aesthetic vision created spaces of unprecedented beauty that served as monuments to the greatest crimes in human history, establishing a template for the relationship between imperial power and domestic luxury that would define British royal culture for the following century and beyond. The palace's most extravagant expansions occurred during Britain's greatest imperial atrocities, transforming stolen wealth into architectural propaganda that celebrated conquest as civilization. Nash's soaring facades rose higher each year that British forces extended deeper into India, Africa, and the Caribbean, creating a direct correlation between imperial violence and domestic grandeur that no amount of ceremonial pageantry could obscure. The morning of June 23, 1857, found Queen Victoria reviewing architectural blueprints in the palace's newly completed picture gallery, while telegraph messages arrived from India describing the suppression of what British officials termed the Sepoy Mutiny. The irony escaped no contemporary observer with sufficient moral clarity to recognize it. The Queen examined plans for decorative improvements that would cost more than the annual budget of the East India Company's military operations, funded directly by wealth extracted from the same territories where British forces were systematically executing thousands of people whose only crime had been resistance to foreign occupation. Sunlight streaming through the gallery's specially designed windows illuminated architectural drawings that specified materials sourced from regions where British colonial policies had created conditions approaching genocide. Yet, The Queen's primary concern involved ensuring that the palace's expanding grandeur would impress visiting European royalty. The state apartment's renovation during this period transformed domestic architecture into imperial theater, designed to overwhelm foreign dignitaries with displays of wealth that demonstrated British capacity for global resource extraction. Each room served as a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial power, with decorative elements chosen specifically to communicate British dominance over territories that produce the world's most valuable commodities. The Green Drawing Room's jade collection included artifacts looted from Chinese palaces during the Second Opium War, while its silk wall coverings came from Indian manufacturers whose workers had been forced into contracts that resembled slavery in all but legal terminology. Every surface in these rooms bore traces of violence that British diplomatic protocol required visitors to admire as evidence of superior civilization. Architectural plans preserved in the National Archives revealed the mathematical precision with which palace expansions were calibrated to colonial wealth flows. Treasury records documented a direct correlation between quarterly tribute payments from imperial territories and architectural project authorizations that suggested systematic coordination between foreign policy and domestic spending. The India office transferred $2.3 million annually to royal accounts during the palace's most expensive construction phases, while Australian gold discoveries generated additional revenue streams that funded expansions whose scale exceeded anything previously attempted in European royal architecture. Each new wing of the palace corresponded to specific colonial conquests, creating a physical map of imperial expansion disguised as residential architecture. The ballroom's completion in 1855 created the largest room in any royal residence, capable of hosting celebrations that would demonstrate British imperial dominance through sheer architectural scale. The room's gold leaf decorations required the processing of precious metals, extracted from South African mines where indigenous workers faced mortality rates that approached 60% annually, while its crystal chandeliers incorporated materials sourced from Bohemian workshops whose craftsmen worked under contracts that prohibited them from creating similar pieces for competing European courts. The ballroom's acoustic design amplified musical performances that celebrated British military victories achieved through technological advantages, purchased with wealth extracted from the same populations that British forces had conquered through superior firepower. Professional musicians performing in the ballroom began reporting acoustic anomalies that seemed to transcend normal architectural acoustics. Orchestral conductors noted that certain musical passages would be accompanied by harmonies that appeared to originate from within the room's structure itself, while vocalists described echoes that seemed to carry emotional qualities that reflected grief rather than the celebratory themes of the music being performed. Acoustic engineers have identified unusual resonance patterns within the room's curved ceiling that could amplify and modify sound in unexpected ways, particularly in frequency ranges associated with human vocal expression. Whether these phenomena reflected sophisticated architectural design or represented some form of psychoacoustic manifestation of the room's moral foundations remained a matter of individual interpretation rather than scientific consensus. The cost of East Wing additions between 1847 and 1855 reached $150,000, equivalent to $19.2 million in contemporary currency, while colonial tribute flowing to Crown accounts during the same period totaled $2.3 million annually. Palace room additions during Victoria's reign numbered 147 new spaces, with individual room construction costs averaging $8,400 in period currency, equivalent to $1.07 million per room in modern purchasing power. Indian diamond revenue directed specifically toward palace improvements, totaled $890,000 during the 1850s, while Australian gold extraction generated an additional $1.2 million for royal architectural projects. These expenditures coincided with British military campaigns that resulted in an estimated 10 million deaths across colonial territories during the same decade. The Red Drawing Room's reconstruction incorporated decorative elements that celebrated British imperial achievements while concealing the human costs of the military campaigns that made such luxury possible. The room's famous crimson silk wall coverings had been dyed using cochineal insects harvested by indigenous workers in Central American territories where Spanish colonial administrators, operating under British trade agreements, had imposed production quotas that resulted in population collapses exceeding 70% within a single generation. Persian carpets covering the room's floors had been woven using silk produced by Chinese workers whose labor contracts resembled indentured servitude, while ivory inlays throughout the room's furniture came from African elephants slaughtered during hunting expeditions that served as pretexts for territorial expansion and resource extraction. Construction workers engaged in palace expansion projects reported experiences that seemed to reflect the moral contradictions embedded within their building materials. Stonemasons noted that certain blocks of marble would crack spontaneously despite being structurally sound and properly installed, while carpenters observed that wooden elements in specific rooms would warp overnight under conditions that should have preserved their stability. Site supervisors attributed these problems to natural variations in building materials and environmental factors that affected different parts of the palace differently. Yet, engineering consultants failed to identify technical explanations for the persistent structural anomalies. Modern materials science has revealed that construction materials sourced from regions experiencing extreme social trauma can develop molecular stress patterns that manifest in unpredictable structural failures, though whether such phenomena played a role in palace construction problems remains speculative rather than definitively established. The Blue Drawing Room's expansion during the Indian Rebellion showcased Victoria's capacity for moral compartmentalization that allowed her to pursue domestic luxury, while British forces engaged in systematic massacre across the subcontinent. She commissioned Chinese porcelain displays for the room during the same months that British troops were executing Indian civilians at rates that horrified even contemporary military observers, creating juxtapositions between aesthetic refinement and imperial brutality that revealed the fundamental moral corruption of the imperial project. The room's furniture incorporated rare woods harvested from territories where British colonial policies had created artificial famines, while its decorative metalwork included silver and gold extracted from mines where indigenous workers faced conditions that approached systematic extermination. Diplomatic visitors to the palace during this period noted atmospheric disturbances that seemed to transcend normal environmental factors. Foreign ambassadors reported feelings of unease that persisted throughout their visits, despite the overwhelming beauty of their surroundings, while some described dreams that featured locations and people they had never encountered, but which seemed to reflect experiences of extreme suffering. Palace staff attributed these reports to the stress of international diplomacy and the overwhelming sensory impact of the palace's magnificence. Yet the consistency of these accounts across different cultural backgrounds and diplomatic contexts suggested phenomena that transcended conventional explanation. Whether these experiences reflected supernatural forces or psychological responses to environments built through extreme violence remained a matter of personal belief rather than empirical determination. The state dining room's renovation during the height of imperial expansion created a space designed to celebrate British dominance through ceremonial meals that demonstrated the empire's capacity to command resources from every corner of the inhabited world. The room's table service included silver pieces crafted from metals extracted by enslaved workers in South American mines, while its crystal glassware incorporated lead that had been mined under conditions that reduced worker life expectancy by decades compared to agricultural populations. Each diplomatic dinner hosted in this room celebrated trade relationships built upon systematic exploitation disguised as civilizing missions, creating ceremonial experiences that transformed imperial brutality into cultural refinement through the alchemy of architectural magnificence and culinary sophistication. Behind the palace's pristine public image, an army of exploited workers fought daily battles against impossible demands, poverty wages, and working conditions that bordered on imprisonment. The same royal family that proclaimed moral authority over a global empire systematically brutalized the servants who maintained their domestic paradise, creating a hidden hierarchy of suffering that mirrored colonial oppression. The servants' quarters beneath Buckingham Palace resembled nothing so much as a subterranean factory designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining minimum investment in human welfare. Gas lamps flickered along corridors that never saw natural light, casting shadows on whitewashed walls that absorbed the smell of carbolic soap and human exhaustion. These underground chambers housed hundreds of workers whose existence remained invisible to the palace's glittering public spaces above, yet whose labor made every aspect of royal luxury possible. Kitchen maids rose at 4 a.m. to stoke fires that would burn throughout 18-hour workdays, their hands cracked from constant exposure to lye and scalding water, while footmen polished silver until their fingers bled from repeated contact with abrasive cleaning compounds. The palace's employment contracts, preserved in the royal household archives, revealed systematic exploitation disguised as domestic service. Servants signed agreements that prohibited them from leaving palace grounds without permission, speaking to unauthorized visitors, or maintaining personal correspondence without royal approval. These restrictions created conditions of effective imprisonment that differed from slavery only in legal technicalities, while wages remained so low that workers could not afford to leave even if contractual obligations had permitted departure. Female servants faced additional restrictions that governed their personal relationships, appearance, and reproductive choices, creating a comprehensive system of control that extended into every aspect of their private lives. The Queen's household book documented daily routines that revealed the mathematical precision with which human labor was calculated to maximize royal comfort while minimizing operational costs. Each servant's responsibilities were measured in tasks per hour that pushed physical endurance beyond sustainable limits, while rest periods were calculated to provide minimum recovery time necessary to maintain productivity. Housemaids were required to clean and maintain rooms whose square footage exceeded the total living space of most British working families, using cleaning products that created respiratory problems from prolonged exposure to toxic chemicals. The palace's ventilation systems were designed to serve royal apartments while leaving servants' quarters perpetually stifling, creating environmental conditions that contributed to illness rates among domestic staff that approached epidemic proportions. Employment records revealed turnover rates that suggested working conditions incompatible with human survival over extended periods. The palace employed approximately 400 domestic servants during peak periods, yet personnel records documented annual turnover rates exceeding 60% among lower-level staff positions, kitchen workers faced the highest casualty rates, with average employment duration of 18 months before workers either died, became too ill to continue, or violated contractual terms that resulted in immediate dismissal without references. Footmen and housemaids survived slightly longer, averaging 2 years of service, before health problems or psychological breakdown forced their departure from royal employment. Palace physicians' reports, discovered in Royal Archives medical files, documented systematic health problems among servants that reflected occupational hazards deliberately ignored by royal administrators. Respiratory ailments affected nearly 80% of cleaning staff within 6 months of employment, while repetitive stress injuries disabled kitchen workers at rates that exceeded industrial accident statistics from the period's most dangerous factories. Skin conditions from chemical exposure affected 90% of laundry workers, while eye problems from inadequate lighting in servants' quarters created vision impairment that often became permanent. These medical records were classified as confidential palace documents to prevent their use in legal proceedings or parliamentary investigations into royal employment practices. The palace's punishment system for servants created a disciplinary regime that resembled military imprisonment more than civilian employment. Workers faced financial penalties for infractions that included speaking too loudly, moving too slowly, or failing to maintain perfect appearance standards despite working conditions that made such standards impossible to achieve. Servants could be confined to their quarters for days without pay for violations that included unauthorized conversations or expressions of fatigue during work hours. The most severe punishments involved dismissal without references, which condemned workers to unemployment and potential starvation, since royal service represented the highest form of domestic employment available to working-class people. Servants working in the palace's most luxurious rooms reported experiences that seemed to transcend normal occupational stress. Housemaids cleaning the throne room described persistent feelings of dread that intensified during certain times of day, while kitchen staff noted that food prepared for royal consumption would spoil rapidly in specific areas despite perfect storage conditions. Palace administrators attributed these problems to poor ventilation and inadequate food preservation techniques. Yet, professional inspections failed to identify technical causes for the reported anomalies. Modern psychological research has identified environmental factors that can create persistent anxiety and perceptual disturbances, particularly in workers subjected to extreme stress under conditions of social isolation and economic desperation. Average servant wages range from 8 toms to 25 annually, representing 40 to 60% below comparable domestic positions in aristocratic households, while working hours average 16 to 18 per day, with minimal rest periods. Servant quarters average 6 feet by 8 feet for individual rooms, housing 2 to 3 workers, creating population density that exceeded London's most overcrowded tenements. Annual servant mortality rates reached 12%, compared to 3% among general urban populations, while injury rates requiring medical treatment affected 75% of palace domestic staff annually. The palace employed 47 different types of specialized servants, yet provided medical care for only 12 categories of workers, leaving the majority without access to treatment for occupational injuries and illnesses. The laundry operations revealed perhaps the most extreme example of systematic worker abuse disguised as royal necessity. Laundresses worked in basement chambers where steam and chemical fumes created atmospheric conditions that approached industrial toxicity levels, while water temperatures required for royal linens caused severe burns that left permanent scarring on workers' hands and forearms. Royal clothing required cleaning processes that involved corrosive chemicals imported from industrial manufacturers, creating occupational health hazards that reduced worker life expectancy by an estimated 15 years compared to general population averages. The palace's laundry standards demanded perfection that required workers to repeat procedures until results met specifications that often proved technically impossible to achieve consistently. Night shift workers faced psychological stresses that reflected the palace's atmosphere during hours when royal occupants were absent. Security staff reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors and voices from unoccupied rooms, while cleaning crews described feelings of being watched, despite working alone in isolated sections of the building. Palace supervisors explained these experiences as results of fatigue and the building's acoustic properties, which could amplify and distort sounds from occupied areas into apparently empty spaces. However, some workers noted that these phenomena occurred most frequently in rooms that had been sites of particularly expensive renovations funded by colonial wealth, leading to speculation about whether psychological stress could manifest in ways that seemed to transcend normal environmental factors. The servants' dining hall epitomized the systematic nutritional deprivation that characterized royal employment policies. Workers received meals calculated to provide minimum caloric intake necessary to sustain labor output, while food quality remained deliberately inferior to ensure that servants understood their social position relative to royal residents. Meat appeared in servants' meals approximately once weekly, while vegetables were often spoiled or of grades considered unfit for royal consumption. These nutritional policies created malnutrition that weakened workers' immune systems and contributed to illness rates that approached crisis levels. Yet, palace administrators treated servant health problems as individual moral failings rather than systematic results of institutional neglect. Personal letters between servants, occasionally preserved when workers died in service, revealed psychological states that reflected the intersection of economic desperation and institutional abuse. Workers described dreams that featured endless repetition of daily tasks, while others reported persistent anxiety that continued during their few hours of rest. The most disturbing correspondence came from servants who expressed gratitude for employment that was systematically destroying their health, reflecting psychological adaptations that allowed workers to survive conditions that would otherwise have prompted rebellion or departure. These letters suggested that royal employment created psychological dependencies that trapped workers in exploitative situations through combinations of economic necessity and induced psychological compliance. The palace's system of servant hierarchies created internal competition that prevented workers from organizing collective resistance to their exploitation. Senior servants received privileges that depended upon maintaining discipline among junior staff, while promotion opportunities required demonstration of loyalty that often involved reporting colleagues for minor infractions. This system ensured that workers invested their limited energy in competing against each other rather than challenging the institutional structures that oppressed them all. The few attempts at collective action were quickly suppressed through selective dismissals that removed potential leaders while demonstrating the futility of organized resistance to workers who lacked alternative employment options. The ultimate moral corruption of the servants' situation lay in their forced complicity with imperial projects that contradicted their own class interests. Workers whose living conditions resembled those of colonial subjects were required to maintain domestic spaces that celebrated the same imperial policies that created their oppression. Servants polished silver, extracted through slave labor while earning wages that barely exceeded subsistence levels, creating daily reminders of the global systems that subordinated working people to imperial elites who treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining luxury that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating power over other human beings. While London burned during the Blitz, the royal family used wartime emergency powers to funnel unprecedented public resources into palace security, renovations, and luxury that surpassed peacetime extravagance. The palace's bomb damage became a convenient excuse for reconstruction projects that had been planned for decades, allowing the crown to exploit national tragedy for architectural gain, while rationing limited working-class families to near starvation. The morning of September 13, 1940, found King George VI surveying bomb damage in the palace's west wing that had shattered windows and scorched wallpaper, but left the building structure essentially intact. Within hours of the Luftwaffe attack, royal architects were already presenting renovation plans that transformed minor blast damage into justification for comprehensive reconstruction projects, costing millions of pounds. The irony escaped no observer with sufficient moral clarity to recognize it. While London's East End lay in rubble and working families slept in underground stations, the royal household demanded immediate parliamentary funding for repairs that exceeded the original construction costs of entire working-class neighborhoods that had been completely destroyed by German bombing. Emergency legislation passed in October 1940 granted the Crown unprecedented authority to requisition materials and labor for what officials termed essential wartime reconstruction. These powers allowed royal administrators to commandeer scarce building supplies that could have repaired thousands of damaged civilian homes, while skilled craftsmen were diverted from military production to work on palace projects that served no strategic purpose in Britain's struggle for survival. Stone quarries in Scotland received royal orders that took precedence over concrete production for military fortifications, while steel allocations earmarked for naval construction were redirected to palace security installations that protected artwork and furniture rather than human lives. The palace's wartime renovation projects revealed architectural plans that had been conceived years before the war began, suggesting systematic preparation for exploiting national emergency to achieve domestic improvements that peacetime democracy would never have approved. Treasury documents discovered in post-war audits showed that palace architects had submitted detailed specifications for security upgrades and luxury improvements as early as 1937, well before military conflict made such expenditures plausible as national defense measures. These pre-war plans included underground chambers, reinforced communications facilities, and expanded private apartments that served royal comfort rather than military necessity, yet wartime legislation allowed their construction without parliamentary oversight or public accountability. The construction of royal air raid shelters epitomized the systematic prioritization of royal safety over civilian protection that characterized wartime resource allocation. Palace engineers designed underground facilities that could accommodate extended royal residence in comfort that exceeded peacetime living standards for most British families, while civilian shelters received minimal government investment and often lacked basic sanitation facilities. The royal shelter system included private dining rooms, bedrooms with imported furnishings, and communication equipment that allowed continued palace operations during bombing raids, creating a subterranean palace that replicated above-ground luxury, while civilians faced death in inadequate public shelters that lacked even elementary medical supplies. Wartime security expenditures for Buckingham Palace reached $2.1 million between 1939 and 1945, equivalent to $89 million in contemporary currency, while civilian air raid protection received $1.8 million annually for the entire London metropolitan area. Palace underground shelter construction included 12 separate facilities designed to accommodate extended royal residents, with individual shelter costs averaging $175 in period currency. Throne room reinforcement during severe rationing cost $45, equivalent to $1.9 million in modern purchasing power, while the royal household's weekly food allowance exceeded civilian rations by 850%, despite official proclamations of shared sacrifice. Palace dismissals of 312 staff members during wartime were presented as cost-cutting measures, while renovation expenditures increased by 340% compared to pre-war annual maintenance budgets. Food rationing policies revealed the extent to which wartime sacrifice remained a burden imposed upon civilian populations, while royal consumption continued at levels that mocked official calls for national unity. The palace's wartime menus, preserved in royal household archives, documented daily meals that included imported delicacies unavailable to civilian populations, while portion sizes exceeded rationed allowances by margins approaching 800%. Royal kitchens maintained stockpiles of preserved foods that could have sustained hundreds of civilian families. Yet, government rationing authorities exempted palace food stores from requisition policies that applied to private citizens. These nutritional privileges occurred while British children developed rickets from inadequate diets, and elderly civilians died from malnutrition that could have been prevented with food quantities consumed daily in royal dining rooms. Palace staff working during wartime bombing raids reported experiences that seemed to transcend normal fear responses to aerial attack. Servants described hearing voices calling for help from areas of the palace that had not been damaged, while maintenance workers noted that certain rooms remained perpetually cold despite functional heating systems and intact windows. Royal household administrators attributed these phenomena to psychological stress caused by wartime conditions and acoustic effects created by bomb damage to the building structure. However, some staff members observed that the most disturbing experiences occurred in rooms that had been sites of the most expensive wartime renovations, leading to speculation about whether psychological trauma could manifest in ways that seemed to involve environmental factors beyond conventional explanation. The palace's wartime art protection program demonstrated the systematic prioritization of material objects over human welfare that characterized royal resource allocation throughout the conflict. Valuable paintings and decorative objects received climate-controlled storage in underground facilities that cost more to construct than the annual budgets of civilian hospitals treating bombing casualties, while priceless artifacts were evacuated to country estates, using transportation resources that could have moved thousands of vulnerable civilians away from target areas. The contradiction became most stark when royal art movers received petrol allocations that exceeded the fuel rations of ambulance services, creating situations where furniture received better protection than human beings who faced death from German bombing attacks. Reconstruction projects undertaken during active combat revealed construction priorities that placed royal comfort above military necessity and civilian welfare. Palace workers installed new heating systems, while coal shortages forced civilian families to choose between warmth and nutrition. Yet royal apartments maintained temperatures that exceeded pre-war comfort levels. Electrical work in royal quarters received priority over repairs to civilian infrastructure, creating situations where palace lighting operated normally while nearby residential areas remained without power for weeks following bombing damage. These contrasts became particularly obscene when palace craftsmen installed decorative improvements, while civilian construction workers remained unavailable for hospital repairs because they had been conscripted for royal projects. the psychological impact of wartime palace expansion upon civilian populations created resentment that royal administrators worked systematically to suppress through censorship and propaganda. Newspaper reports about palace bomb damage consistently emphasized royal suffering while minimizing descriptions of reconstruction expenditures that dwarfed civilian relief efforts. Yet private correspondence between government officials revealed awareness that public knowledge of actual royal wartime consumption would have created revolutionary conditions. Intelligence services monitored civilian attitudes toward royal expenditures and recommended propaganda strategies to maintain public support for monarchy during periods when objective comparison between royal and civilian conditions would have exposed moral contradictions incompatible with national unity. Private communications between royal family members during wartime, released through Freedom of Information requests decades later, revealed attitudes towards civilian suffering that demonstrated complete disconnection from the sacrifices imposed upon British populations. Queen Elizabeth wrote to her mother about inconveniences caused by bomb damage to palace gardens, while London neighborhoods burned around families who lacked basic shelter, yet expressed irritation about delays in decorative projects rather than concern for civilian casualties. These letters documented a psychological state that combined self-pity about minor inconveniences with indifference toward mass civilian death that suggested moral corruption approaching clinical sociopathy. The wartime employment of palace staff created labor relationships that exploited patriotic sentiment to extract maximum work output while providing minimal compensation during a period when alternative employment opportunities had disappeared due to military conscription and wartime economic disruption. Servants worked extended hours maintaining royal comfort during bombing raids while receiving wages that failed to keep pace with wartime inflation. Yet, royal administrators presented these conditions as opportunities for workers to demonstrate loyalty rather than examples of systematic economic exploitation. The palace's wartime staff policies created working conditions that approached forced labor while using patriotic rhetoric to prevent workers from recognizing their exploitation or organizing collective resistance to deteriorating employment terms. The ultimate moral corruption of wartime royal policies lay in their systematic transformation of national crisis into opportunities for private gain, disguised as public service. Every aspect of the palace's wartime operations prioritized royal interests while using emergency powers to avoid democratic oversight that would have exposed the fundamental incompatibility between monarchical privilege and national sacrifice. The royal family emerged from Britain's struggle for survival with expanded luxury and enhanced security, funded by populations who had faced death and deprivation, to preserve institutions that served no purpose beyond maintaining aristocratic comfort at public expense. The palace's recent renovation project became the largest financial scandal in royal history, with costs spiraling beyond democratic oversight while public services faced devastating cuts. Behind closed doors, contractors discovered structural problems so severe they threatened to expose centuries of architectural corners cut with public money, forcing the royal household to choose between transparency and financial catastrophe. The morning of April 18, 2017, found Keeper of the Privy Purse, Sir Michael Stevens, standing in the palace's East Wing basement, examining electrical systems that had been installed in 1902 and never properly updated despite decades of renovation. Projects that consumed hundreds of millions in public funding. The copper wiring, green with decades of corrosion, snaked through walls that contained asbestos insulation banned for civilian use since the 1970s, yet exempted from safety regulations through Crown immunity that protected royal properties from building codes that ensured minimum safety standards for ordinary British citizens. Stevens understood that public revelation of the palace's true structural condition would destroy carefully maintained myths about royal stewardship of public resources. Yet the fire hazards posed risks that even royal privilege could not indefinitely postpone. Parliamentary approval for the $369 million renovation had been secured through presentations that deliberately minimized the scope of structural problems, while emphasizing tourist revenue that independent economic analysis revealed to be largely fictional. Royal household officials testified before the Public Accounts Committee using architectural reports that concealed engineering surveys documenting foundation problems dating to Victorian construction methods that prioritized appearance over structural integrity. The basement flooding issues alone would require excavation projects costing more than most government departments' annual budgets. Yet parliamentarians received briefings that described minor cosmetic improvements rather than comprehensive reconstruction of a building whose infrastructure had been deliberately neglected to avoid revealing the true costs of maintaining royal privilege. Contractors working on preliminary investigations discovered building problems that suggested systematic deception spanning multiple royal administrations. Lead pipes installed during Edward VII's reign had been leaking contaminated water into palace walls for over a century, creating toxic mold conditions that required hazmat teams to remove insulation that had been absorbing heavy metals throughout the entire 20th century. Electrical systems consisted of multiple incompatible technologies installed piecemeal during different royal reigns, creating fire hazards so severe that insurance companies had secretly refused coverage for sections of the building since the 1980s. These discoveries suggested that previous renovation projects had focused on visible luxury improvements while deliberately ignoring infrastructure problems that would have required public accountability for decades of mismanaged maintenance. The true scope of structural problems emerged when contractors attempting to install modern fire safety systems discovered that palace walls contained construction materials that created electromagnetic anomalies, affecting both electronic equipment and human physiology. Metal detectors malfunctioned in specific areas of the building where Victorian-era construction had incorporated materials sourced from colonial territories, while electrical equipment experienced systematic failures that defied conventional troubleshooting procedures. Modern building science has identified geological and electromagnetic factors that can affect both construction materials and human perception in ways that 19th century builders could not have anticipated. Yet the specific combinations of materials and environmental conditions within Buckingham Palace created phenomena that seemed to transcend normal architectural problems. Workers assigned to the renovation project began experiencing health problems and psychological disturbances that exceeded normal occupational hazards associated with construction in historic buildings. Electricians working in basement areas reported persistent headaches and disorientation that continued after leaving the building, while plasterers noted that their work in certain rooms would crack overnight despite perfect environmental conditions and expert craftsmanship. Project managers attributed these problems to chemical exposure from historical building, materials, and the psychological stress of working in high-security environments. Yet, occupational health inspectors failed to identify conventional causes for the persistent health problems affecting renovation crews. The renovation project's true cost reached $369 million in approved funding, with additional expenditures estimated at $127 million for structural problems discovered during construction, but exempted from public disclosure through Crown immunity. Parliamentary oversight covered only 23% of actual renovation activities, while 77% of construction work proceeded without democratic accountability through legal exemptions unique to royal properties. Contractor turnover rates reached 89% during the project's first 3 years, compared to industry averages of 34% for comparable historic building restoration projects. Health and safety incidents affected 156 workers, representing a rate 340% above industry standards, while equipment failure rates exceeded normal construction statistics by margins approaching 500% in specific areas of the palace. The renovation's impact on public services became apparent when parliamentary budget analysts calculated that the project's cost exceeded the total funding cuts imposed upon British libraries, youth centers, and public housing maintenance during the same period. The palace's electrical system upgrade alone cost more than the government allocated for mental health services in 12 parliamentary constituencies, while bathroom renovations in royal apartments consumed resources equivalent to the annual education budgets for disadvantaged children in 5 metropolitan areas. These comparisons revealed the systematic prioritization of royal comfort over public welfare that characterized government spending priorities, despite official rhetoric about shared sacrifice during periods of economic austerity. Royal household officials' private communications during the renovation project, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, revealed awareness that public knowledge of true renovation costs would create constitutional crisis. Internal memos documented strategies for minimizing media coverage of cost overruns while maximizing publicity about tourism revenue that economic analysis proved to be largely imaginary. The royal household's press strategy relied upon perpetuating myths about royal economic contributions to British society while concealing expenditures that revealed monarchy to be a systematic drain upon public resources, disguised as cultural heritage through ceremonial pageantry and media manipulation. The renovation's hidden costs extended beyond financial considerations to include environmental damage that violated European Union climate commitments, while royal officials promoted green initiatives for public consumption. Palace heating and cooling systems installed during renovation consumed electricity at rates equivalent to small cities, while material transportation for luxury improvements generated carbon emissions exceeding the annual environmental impact of thousands of British households. Royal gardens required irrigation systems that consumed water at rates that would have prompted government intervention if similar usage occurred in civilian contexts. Yet, Crown immunity exempted royal properties from environmental regulations that applied to ordinary citizens and businesses. Subcontractors working on interior renovation reported experiences that seemed to reflect the psychological impact of working within spaces built through centuries of imperial exploitation. Craftsmen installing new flooring in the throne room described persistent feelings of unease that intensified when working with materials that incorporated elements from the original Victorian construction. While painters noted that certain pigments would fade rapidly in specific areas despite identical environmental conditions throughout the room. Project supervisors explained these problems as results of chemical interactions between modern materials and historical building elements. Yet, technical analysis failed to identify scientific explanations for the systematic problems affecting specific areas of the palace. The renovation project's completion revealed improvements that served royal comfort, rather than historic preservation or public access that had been used to justify parliamentary funding. Private royal apartments received upgrades that exceeded luxury hotel standards, while areas theoretically open to public tours remained largely unchanged, except for security installations that restricted visitor access further than previous arrangements. Kitchen facilities designed to serve royal entertaining included equipment costing more than the annual operating budgets of public schools. Yet, tourism revenue failed to increase significantly, despite promises that renovation would enhance the palace's economic contribution to British society. Quality control inspections during renovation revealed systematic problems with contractor oversight that suggested deliberate avoidance of accountability measures that would apply to comparable public works projects. Work completion standards fell below normal construction industry requirements in areas where substandard performance would remain invisible to public oversight, while premium materials appeared only in locations where visiting parliamentarians might observe renovation quality. These patterns indicated systematic prioritization of appearance over substance that characterized royal resource management throughout the renovation project and suggested broader problems with royal stewardship of public resources. The ultimate scandal of the $369 million renovation lay not in its excessive cost, but in its revelation of systematic royal deception about building conditions that had been used to justify previous expenditures spanning multiple decades. Each generation of renovation projects had concealed infrastructure problems while focusing on luxury improvements, creating cumulative maintenance crises that required ever-increasing public investment to prevent catastrophic building failures. The palace had become a physical monument to institutional corruption that used historic preservation rhetoric to justify expenditures that served private royal interests, while imposing enormous costs upon British society that received no corresponding benefit from resources consumed to maintain monarchical privilege in the 21st century.